hay fever, you probably don't much like pollen, and you might not like bees either. But together, these two provide an amazing service for mankind. Today's Wild is all about pollination, and I, Sasha Norris, am joined by Chris O'Toole, who loves bees. Chris, why do you like bees so much?
Well, I've been studying them for more than 30 years. In Britain we have more than 250 species, and in the Mediterranean, where I spend a lot of my time studying bees, we've got probably 2,000 to 3,000. So there's an awful lot of them to get to know. They all have interesting life histories, interesting ways of making a living in relation to flowering plants and how and where they nest.
Now we're standing in amongst the foliage of an apple tree, because they also, along with a lot of other pollinators, provide this service, don't they, to humans?
Indeed. In fact, every third mouthful of human food is dependent, directly or indirectly, on the unmanaged pollination services of bees. So we really do depend on these little fairy buttes.
So every time we eat, we're eating food which has come from pollination. How does that work?
Well, pollination is the process by which the male parts of flowering plants, pollen, is transported usually by insects, mostly bees, or sometimes by wind, to the female sexual parts of another flower or another apple tree. So pollination is basically mating by proxy.
So this apple, for example, here, these young apples that are developing here, that will eventually, well not this one, but will eventually develop into edible apples, that wouldn't be able to develop and grow unless an insect had pollinated it.
Yes, what that apple has required is a bee to bring pollen to the flower from another tree, another individual tree. And this is why pollination is so important, because an awful lot of important fruit crops and other food crops are dependent on cross-pollination. Plants, they can't pollinate themselves, it has to be pollinated by another individual of the same species.
Now there are around 240,000 flowering plant species, and I understand that of those 220,000 are pollinated by animals.
Yes.
And the other 20,000 are pollinated mainly by wind, including, I think, are the grasses pollinated by wind?
Yes, they're almost all pollinated by wind.
So that includes sort of wheat and barley, and
yes,
which is a large proportion of our food. So when we're talking about insect-pollinated food, we're talking about things like fruit and vegetables, are we?
We're talking fruit and vegetables. We're talking about things like Brazil nuts, and of course a lot of our meat products depend on pollination, because our cattle have to feed on, in many parts of the world, feed on forage crops such as clover, alfalfa, sainfoin, and these are all bee pollinated.
Oh, okay, so you're talking about feeding the cattle with a crop that's been grown for their food, and that's been pollinated.
The cattle depend on pollination, and we depend on the cattle.
That's quite a canny link. You wouldn't have thought, you wouldn't necessarily think of that.
And in New Zealand, where the local bees are very primitive and too short-tongued to pollinate clover, which supports the huge sheep and cattle industry, which we depended on for access to cheap dairy products after the Second World War. That all depends on the pollination services provided by 4 species of bumblebees, which were imported to New Zealand in the 1890s because the local bees couldn't do the job. And every year, up until then, every year New Zealand had to import clover seeds. Within 4 years they were actually exporting clover seeds. That gives you an idea of just how important and how dramatic an economic turnaround, adequate pollination, can bring about.
Now, most pollination is what you refer to as unmanaged, which means it's basically wild insects going around doing this job, collecting the pollen for themselves, which they then feed to their young, don't they, as well as, and they collect nectar from flowers.
Yes, we're talking about bees now. The bees are the ones who actually collect pollen.
Yeah, yeah. And then other insects actually just incidentally transfer pollen between...
they get covered with pollen when they visit flowers, and when they visit another flower of the same species, so that pollen gets rubbed off onto the female parts of the flower, and pollination is affected.
Now the flowers actually produce more pollen than they need, don't they, in order that
Yes.
the bees can...
Yes, you can regard pollination as a kind of marketplace with producers in the form of flowers which produce nectar as a reward to attract bees to the flowers and also pollen in excessive amounts of pollen to reward the bees as a food resource, and the bees are consumers. So you have this economy.
They're advertising. The flowers are actually adverts,
yes.
aren't they? To say
yes.
That's what flowers are for, we think, to actually
yes.
signal to
yes.
pollinators and say, I'm here, here's my pollen,
exactly.
come and get it.
If you think about a flower makes considerable prior investments to buy itself into the marketplace. It invests in pigments, synthesizing pigments, making brightly coloured petals. It invests in excess pollen and nectar.
And smelling good.
So these prior investments are made before they actually get into the marketplace. And bees also make an investment before they can, in order to buy into the marketplace, because female bees don't start the business of pollination until they've found a nest site and established a nest and built the first cell which will receive the first pollen load.
And we also know that some flowers have ultraviolet signals, don't they? So they don't just look the way we see them, but they actually have colours which bees can perceive.
Yes,
different to the colours we can perceive.
Yes, bees see into much further into the blue end of the spectrum than we do, and they can see reflected ultraviolet light. So a lot of flowers which we find attractive because we think they're pale blue or even another colour, in fact look very different to bees. Because
and sometimes flowers which aren't striped to
indeed.
us actually have stripes in the ultraviolet.
That's
so if you're with a bee's eye view, they look completely different.
Exactly. Yes, they're big, loud, blousy calling cards saying, "Look here, come and visit me."
Okay, but our bees have been getting into trouble recently, haven't they?
Yes, well, of the 250 species or so we have in Britain, 25% are now on the Red Data Book list of endangered species. And this is because modern agriculture has created an environment which is not very bee friendly by destroying habitats, hedgerows for example. We've lost 160,000 kilometres of hedgerow in Britain since about 1950.
And bees live in hedgerows?
Well, a lot of bees. Bumblebees like to live in hedgerows, in old mouse nests. Hedgerows contain normal hedgerows contain lots of dead wood and broken off twigs, broken off bramble stems and hogweed stems, where a variety of bees can nest. But modern agriculture, apart from destroying or reducing the structural complexity of the environment and therefore reducing the number of available nest sites, has also reduced floral diversity. So we have far fewer wild flowers growing around the edges of fields, the edges of woods and copses.
I mean, this has been in an effort to make farming more productive. We've lost kind of what people refer to as weeds, but in doing so we've also lost beneficial insects.
Yes. So, for example, there are 6 bumblebee species which up until about 10 or 15 years ago were reasonably widespread and common. They're now under serious threat, and one of them is almost certainly now extinct.
But we've also had a problem with a mite, haven't we, that's been attacking honeybees?
Yes, that's a problem. A mite that jumped the species barrier from one of the oriental honeybees and has now attacked honeybee colonies all over Western Europe and North America. Most beekeepers will have now experienced this mite. It's called varroa, and there are ways of dealing with the mite, but these methods involve much more frequent inspection of hives and the use of very expensive chemicals to kill the mites. And this has made beekeeping a much more expensive and a much more labour-intensive activity. And the result of that, unfortunately, is that over the last 10 to 15 years, in Britain we've lost between 40 and 45% of our beekeepers.
40, that's huge, isn't it? I mean, that's a lot of beekeepers. Now, these beekeepers often provide the service for standing in an orchard for market gardeners or for farmers and actually bring their bees to pollinate their crops, don't they?
That's right, yes. They move a number of beehives into an orchard for pollination purposes during the flowering period, and the orchard owner pays them a fee. They sign a contract, and then they move them out again when flowering is over. But this kind of collaboration between beekeeper and orchard owner is now declining simply because we've lost so many beekeepers.
Now you are trying to develop solutions to this, aren't you?
Yes, well, we have some species of bees in Britain and all over Europe and Central Asia which are not affected by the varroa mite. They're called mason bees, and they're very, very efficient pollinators of apple crops and other crops, and they take very well to the greenhouse and polytunnel environment. So they have great potential for strawberries, for peppers, courgettes, and they're called mason bees.
Well, I'm going to stop you there, Chris, because by the magic of television we're going to transfer to your back garden where we've got some of these bees. So Chris, Louis is very interested in your specially constructed nests for red mason bees you've got in your garden. And this is one solution to the problem of not having enough places for bees to live in the wild.
That's right. Our nest kits, developed after years of research at Oxford, mimic the natural nest sites, which would be hollow plant stems like hogweed stems, bramble stems.
And these are specifically for bees that do nest in stems, because obviously bees nest in lots of different places.
Or as you can see here, beetle borings in dead wood.
Okay, so should we have a look at one?
Yes.
Louis, mind out, love. Okay, right.
It's basically a cardboard tube with a soda straw liner, and this, as you can see, this is a completed one, indicated by the mud partition. These bees are called mason bees because they make walls out of mud to partition the cells. There'll be 8 or 10 cells along this tube.
So this is a cardboard tube, and in nature they would nest in sort of the hollow stems of plants.
Yes.
Or holes in wood.
Yes.
And when you say beetle boring, so that would be where a beetle has gone through
That's
in a
right.
dead wood.
That's right. Yes.
Okay, and then they lay their babies in sections along these.
They make a cell one at a time.
Yep.
Store it with pollen, lay an egg, then seal it with mud, then make another pollen store working backwards, lay an egg, seal it with mud, and so in the end there'll be 8 or 10 cells with the female eggs at the back and the males at the front, and roundabout, and they will feed the females who have done this work will die round about the end of June, and the larvae that hatch out from the eggs feed up on the pollen. Round about the end of August, those larvae spin a tough brown silk cocoon, pupate, and then become adult, and then they remain as adults over the winter until the following spring, when they come out and start the whole cycle all over again.
And do they live inside here over the winter?
Yes, they remain in here over the winter as adults in their natal cells.
Chris, a lot of people might think that there's only one kind of bee, or all bees are the same.
No, there aren't. There are 256 species in Britain, some of them very, very specialised, such as this one, Colites davisanus, which only collects pollen from daisy-type flowers.
So this is a daisy bee. And what else have we got? Something else down there?
Down here is a very, very tiny species, which is not a specialist, but it nests in very, very tiny crevices in stones and old walls and leaves, plant stems.
It's a very little bee, isn't it, compared to your bee?
It is indeed.
One of the 256 species we have.
254.
54. It's a lot.
And 25% of our native bees in Britain are on the Red Data Book list of endangered species, so we've got to start thinking about their conservation.
So of all the bees we have, 1/4 of them are potentially endangered.
Yes.
They need help.
They need help.
Need our help.
Here I persuaded a couple of females to nest in
plastic tubes?
well, they're glass actually.
This one specifically, this one here. Yeah. Oh, they're glass, are they?
Yes, here you can see a larva. The egg is hatched and the larva is busy feeding on the pollen. in these two cells here.
So they collect up the pollen and give it to the babes or the eggs, so that when the larvae hatch out they can eat it?
Yes. The first thing to do is store the pollen. They don't lay an egg until they've completed the pollen store, and then they lay an egg and then immediately seal it with mud.
How much pollen do they need?
It's about 10 or 15 foraging flights.
Now these bees are very good at collecting pollen, aren't they? They're very efficient.
Yes. They have the pollen collecting apparatus in the form of a dense brush on the underside of the abdomen, which means that they come into direct contact with the sexual parts of the flower, which makes them excellent pollinators of apples and plums.
So they rub their belly onto the sexual parts of the flower?
That's right, yes.
Is that what you're saying? That's
so they play a very vital role in the sex life of the plants. This is mating by proxy for the plants.
Mating by proxy, because what you mean is they go from the male to the female and sort of rub themselves.
Yes.
Yeah.
I mean, plants are literally rooted to the spot, so they require some agency to take the male parts of the cycle, the pollen, which is the equivalent of our sperm, to a female, and they rely on insects to do this. And bees are specialists in doing this.
Now your bees are not only really efficient, they're much more efficient than honeybees, aren't they?
Well, so far as apple and other orchard crops are concerned, yes, because 500 of these bees will more than adequately pollinate a hectare of apple trees at commercial densities, whereas the recommended density for beehives was 3 to 4 hives, each with about between 20 and 60,000 workers in it. So if you do your sums, one of these bees will do the work of about 120 honeybees.
Right.
And what's more, they will fly at temperatures below which the honeybee is grounded, and at any given temperature they will visit more flowers per minute than the honeybee, and on any given foraging trip they're much more promiscuous than the honeybee in terms
They're
of
super bees.
the number of trees they visit.
Super bees,
Yes.
The red mason bee. And so you're promoting this to people who need pollinators?
Yes. Well, we're selling these nests to via a spin-out company from Oxford University. We're selling them to green-minded gardeners who want to take charge of the pollination ecology of their gardens. But also, next year we will be leasing live bees to commercial growers for pollination purposes. So we will lease them the bees, we'll put out occupied nests during the flowering period of their crop, and then at the end of the season we will take them back in and we will overwinter them and bring the next generation on the following year.
Okay, which is really good news. We're going to go now and have a look at some where you've done this. This is your garden obviously, and you've got quite a lot of bee nests here, and you've got nice flowers especially for the bees to provide pollen for them. But we're going to go and have a look at an experiment you're doing, aren't we, on a much bigger scale for commercial growers?
Yes, this is in a walled orchard in Whiteham.
Right, let's go. And red mason bees don't like stinging either.
Push this one. Right, these are my...
Okay.
Now next year it's going to be much more professional. We're having properly made boxes which aren't going to bow and bend, and we're going to have these little cylinders. We're going to have boxes that hold 400 nests straight up. See, we've got some occupied nests there. Now, if you look at the walls here,
yeah,
the early Victorian walls, see the riddled with nail holes because they used to put trellises up here.
right.
And there are the bee that we filmed in the garden, which is a specialist on the daisy, nests in these holes. Right?
Does it?
Yeah. And the red mason bee doesn't excavate its own holes. It only uses pre-existing things like beetle borings or hollow plant stems, but it will use these holes, you see, made by the other bee, which is extended nail holes. So that's why I thought this would be a great place for the red mason bee. So I thought I'd put nests in here which were unseeded without unoccupied nests just to see what was attracted. And we'll see that 2 weeks ago we had 59 occupied nests.
And we have to count them now and see how many we've got now.
Yes, but the problem is that the females are programmed, the females of the red mace are programmed to patrol up and down linear features in the environment, like hedgerows, like woodland edge, to look for nests. And these nests are a little too far out.
Right.
That's why I didn't predict there would be tremendous uptake.
Right.
But I wanted to understand, to see if that perception was true. And that's why I put one that's in a direct line of this old greenhouse,
right, okay.
because they will also be nesting in the old woodwork of the greenhouse.
So they'll zoom along here.
Yeah. Yeah.
You're a girl bee.
Yeah.
And you come along here.
That's right.
And you might
And this,
well
I
go,
predicted that this one
that looks a nice place to nest.
would have more than the others. And there were 19 last time. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, 13, 14, 15.
16!
Yeah.
Full of baby bees.
This is without seeding them, without putting nests out which were occupied.
Right.
So what I want to do is to go along the row and just make a record of the
Let's count.
of the count.
Bees.
So
Oh, Betty, we've got to count
get
some
me.
bees. We're always doing sensible things like counting bees on our programme.
Let me get something to write on. I left my notebook at home.
As the viewers will know.
I will later
We're writing the data on the back of a 6TV card.
on. Right.
Here, can we have a look at it, Chris? Just the card. Because we don't have a notebook. Right.
Okay, let's go.
do it.
Now this orchard and species of apples, which
Dr. Barry Juniper
juniper.
is making a study here in this orchard of unusual varieties of apples. Is that
Yes,
right?
and species of apples that he's brought back from Central Asia, which is the centre of diversity for
Apples.
wild apple species.
Wild apples.
And so he's quite happy to have my bees in here because,
Because the bees help.
yes.
Right,
So
I'll count these ones. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7. So Chris, 59 nests.
yes, and we've got a nationwide propagation programme just like this, but on a much larger scale.
So you've got thousands of these all over the country.
Indeed, we have.
What's the point?
Next year, we aim to be able to lease occupied nests to orchard owners for pollination purposes. Then, at the end of their flowering season, we take the nests back, we overwinter the bees, and look after them, and then make them available again the following year.
You're looking after bees so they can look after our food pollination.
Exactly.
And you can also buy your nest at garden centres, can't you?
Yes, gardeners who want to look after the bees in their garden and improve their local pollination can do precisely that. And they can contact us at our website, which is www.oxbeeco.com.
Let's have that again, www.
Oxbeeco.
Oxbeeco, is that OXBEECO?
That's right.
.com.
That's right.
Thanks very much, Chris O'Toole.
You're welcome.
That's it from Wild this week. Till next time, keep it buzzing.
I'm supposed to buzz after you, aren't I?
Yeah, you're supposed to buzz off now. We're buzzing off.